So a recent job I had come across my desk was a commission for a 1970s 80s style fantasy sci-fi cover. And of course, I jumped at the chance to do this. It had to be a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's definitely something that is riffing off the covers of Frank Frazetta, Richard Corbin, anything you might have seen in the early epic magazines that were put out by Marvel. And today I'm going to show you a bit about the process behind making this cover. Now, I decided to go all out, and so I'm using Blender to create a lovely 3D shiny golden extruded text here. And as you can see, there's the model. And initially I thought, oh look, I'll just do a straight across render, but I thought, look, I need a second just in case, and so I put a bend modifier on the elements and did a re-render. Now, of course, this is all at about 600 dpi, so the renders that you saw happening there did not happen instantly. They happened, it was about a 15-20 minute render. And here's a sketch that I was working on, just sort of commuting back and forth between home and college, that I quite liked for the hero of this. It was inspired by a cover that Frank Frazetta did for John Carter of Mars, but of course I couldn't really use the exact same pose. And so, I looked up some references, running references, that sort of stuff, and did some sketches, basically eyeballing those. And then I just imported that as a backdrop into Clip Studio Pro. And what you're seeing me do here is, on a separate layer, I'm applying my digital pencils. Now, once I've got those digital pencils down, I do a little bit of further editing of those pencils, because I want to get this absolutely right. And one advantage of going digital is that you can fix up any anatomy that doesn't look just right because maybe the photo was taken from a different angle. You can flip the image over like you're seeing here. And what this gives you an advantage to do is, most artists have a bias, and my bias seems to sort of lean a certain way. And so by flipping, I can actually very quickly see where those problem areas are and fix up the figure in its sort of flipped pose before flipping back, and then sort of course correcting, as it were, so that I can sort of be ensured that it doesn't look too lopsided, it doesn't look too unbalanced, because sometimes you just can't see those things in front of you. Now, of course, my penciling can take a couple of layers to get right, and so here I'm basically doing a second pass on the pencils above, all in an attempt to get the best possible pencils down before I apply my digital inks. Now, my favorite brush to use in Clip Studio is I think it's called a G pen. It seems to have the best weight response for what I want to do. It's just got that lovely taper to it. And it's very responsive on my Intuos 4. Yeah, I'm still using an Intuos 4 plugged in via USB. I know a lot of people have better systems of drawing, but this one has served me well over the years, and it hasn't died yet. Now, of course, digital inks, the way I sort of get them done quickly is often if I like the way I've drawn something, like, say, this eye, duplicating and sort of copying over and then modifying is something that I do quite a bit. There's a little cheat for you, I guess. But the inks go on quite quickly, and, there's always still a lot of correction, even at inking phase. One of the areas that I find sometimes very satisfying, but often infuriating, because it's very difficult to do, like the ends. But hair is, yeah, I really spend the time to get the hair right. I still don't have a style or a technique that I prefer. I try to get like the ends showing so that you sort of get the basic shape, but that you see that it's flowing hair, you know what I mean? And it is very hard to get right. And so you see me sort of like correcting here quite a bit I get it right, I get it wrong. And then it's sort of just simply a matter of getting back onto the other things, the anatomy, the muscles, the arms, that sort of stuff. I've been looking at anatomy quite a bit these days. I sort of want to get this right, as the majority of my comics are very cartoony, and this one had to be something that looked semi-serious. It had to look like anatomically correct, sort of more realistic style comic, and I hadn't done this for quite a bit, and so I'd done a heck of a lot of research before sort of jumping back into this style, and I still don't feel 100% comfortable with it. But look, it's pretty good. I'm quite happy with how these inks are turning out. What I'm doing here is just sort of correcting a few areas, thickening up some lines, sort of making some of the line work less hesitant. I often find that that's a problem with my inks. And now that the main character has been done, I go on to the one-eyed serpent, or the cyclopean serpent, that's supposed to be in the background. And yes, it's the gag here is, as you see it, it's supposed to be very phallic. I talked with the client, and he absolutely loved the idea. This was going to be PantsQuest, where you have this pantsless hero running through a desolate wasteland, chased by a one-eyed serpent. And I was going to sort of make it even more obvious, maybe have some denim there, or some shredded pants there to show that he is in fact a trouser snake. But I think it I think the sort of penisy head kind of really sells it there. So yeah, look, I didn't really need to sort of go overboard any more than I have. Now, scales, I sort of jumped ahead a bit because it's very boring watching me sort of apply the scales. I had to do a little research on drawing serpents and dragons and things, and I hugely admire people who take the time to do this sort of drawing scales on creatures like this. It is insanely time consuming, but if you get the effects right, they add a dimension to your serpent that you just cannot get with light and shade. The scales really allow you to show contour and depth and thickness, and it's a really great way to sort of show a three-dimensionality here. You see like the back scales kind of going around the back there. Now I've got this serpent sort of bursting out of the ground. I sort of liked that idea. It was going to be that this serpent sort of was chasing him across the desert, but then, I got lazy. I didn't want to draw the rest of the body, and I couldn't sort of figure out where the rest of the serpent had to go. And so it's a bit of a cheat, but I also kind of like drawing rocks. It's something that I like, even though, as you're seeing in a minute, Clip Studio has this amazing little cheat. It's got a texture brush that is these sorts of rocks that you can sort of throw around the place and really get some nice rock inks. But I'm pretty okay with drawing those sorts of pillared rocks with some line work that denotes a bit of depth. And what really sells it is if you draw rocks in front of other rocks. That really shows that there's a bit of an explosion there. Sort of break up clean lines and clean directions that rocks are sort of sitting in, and stick another stone in front of that. I find that often helps to sell that idea more than anything, rather than sort of giving way to the thing that you're trying to reveal. Get a little mess in the foreground. Okay, so sort of just cleaning up the inks a little bit more, because this foreground element has got to be really strong. Now I jump over to one of my favorite sites, Color Lovers, to start picking a color scheme. Yeah, I'm lazy. I can pick some colors if I really sort of thought about it, but jumping on Color Lovers and sort of saying, okay, look, I want this desert color and I want a green that goes with it, and you can sort of pick some palettes that are fairly popular and work. And that's a very good way of sort of just stealing the hexadecimal value on one of those colors and pasting it into your color palette, and then just painting away. And so there's some foreground rocks there, and yeah, and just sort of adding in that color before I go over to the green for the snake. Now, I tend to do a quick test brush without doing any masking. But then once I'm happy with it and think, yeah, this is the color I'm going with, I use my lasso tool and I create an area, and then I can either bucket fill or I can just go ahead and paint with a really big brush so that I can get a nice clean area. And again, from the same palette from Color Lovers, there's a green that complements this other green quite nicely. And so just having those two tones, you get that sort of three-dimensionality of the snake. You can sort of see where it curls from the front to the back. Now, choosing a sky color, I sort of couldn't choose it from the same palette, so I chose one of the greens, and I found a palette that had other colors that were more in the yellow tone there for the background. So I thought, well, let's see how that looks. And, I want to repeat some of those colors. So there's the green of the eye. I sort of chose this brown myself based off that green. I thought, oh, look, I'll just sort of push it into the reds a little bit to see where that goes. I was thinking of sort of having barbarian shorts, but the thing that sort of sells PantsQuest is that he's wearing some tighty-whities. So that was there for that very reason. Highlights and shadows, they're generally done on an overlay layer, and I just sort of paint with whites and blacks to begin with, just to get a bit of contrast and sort of see how the tones interact and see if there's enough depth there. As a secondary step, sometimes if I'm very happy with it, I'll sort of merge that down and then start choosing some colors either side of the palette for some light and shade. Now, speaking of shadow, I do a color selection on the character there. And then on a separate layer within an overlay mode, playing around with the opacity, I choose sort of like a complementary color. And so his skin tone is sort of like in the yellows and oranges. And so the shadow has really got to be a complementary in the blues. And then the highlights is basically just got to be a lighter tone off those orange sort of skin tones there. And sort of backwards and forwards, I generally keep it on two separate layers, one for highlights, one for shadow, and then just go backwards and forwards to paint. Just because sometimes the transfer modes for one tone don't work as well as with the other tone, and so I keep it separate and sort of play around, experiment a little bit on the fly between the shadows and the highlights there. I'm not the best at sort of finding the three-dimensionality of this, and so my characters end up looking a little bit flat on first pass. Now, I know that he's sort of leaning forward here, and so evenly toning those pecs and those abs and those thighs, everything looks as though they're in exactly the same plane. There's no sort of depth, but I sort of end up rectifying this towards the end. But this sort of just gives me a sense of three-dimensionality, just to sort of start playing around with the light and shadow. And the beauty of leaving everything on layers is that I can then focus on, say, the snake here for a little while, and then sort of go backwards and forwards between the two elements. Now, the snake, of course, I've spent the time to ink out all those scales, and now all the highlights and shadows have to go in a similar method as I was doing with the guy. The light source is obviously kind of off to the left and a little bit above. I was intending to have this sort of backlit, but you sort of want the three-dimensionality to show around, and so you kind of fudge it a little bit and sort of say, well, maybe it's a bit of bounce lighting, or maybe there's some ambient light that's actually quite strong. In the meantime, I've got to sort of add a layer and try to get some tone happening on this eyeball, because this has got a different texture to the scales. It's something that's a lot more slimy and shiny, and so you sort of want a bit of a gradient, there's a bit of a back low there, and you want some highlights on top to sort of say, okay, look, there's a bit of reflectivity on this surface here. It's a bit slick, it's a bit glistening, and you really sort of have to sell all those materials in this process, and sort of that's what I'm doing. Okay, so I had some feedback from the client, and that was that he loved the idea. I sent him some inks, and he loves the phallicness of it. But he went ahead and said, look, can you add some cacti in there that kind of look like very obviously hairy testicles? And so I thought, okay, yeah, look, I think that's a great idea. And so I first, I'm putting down some foliage. I'm putting down some, some grass and some plants and stuff like that, which in Clip Studio Pro, there's some fantastic brushes there. And these are going to sort of sell this. And there I am drawing these kind of testicular cacti there. They're cactuses, but they look like hairy nuts, and that's the whole point there. It's to sort of sell this sort of phallicness, this Freudian type of cover, and sort of adding a few rocks and some texture there just really brings it all together. And that's what I really love about Clip Studio Pro. You've got these little touches, little brushes there that you can sort of add and really quickly on the fly create environments and texture with those things, just if you use them judiciously. Yeah, look, I sort of copied and pasted and placed them around, and now I'm going to color them again in this sort of what's it called, complementary color. So the desert's your oranges and your yellows, and I don't want to sort of steer too far away from the greens, and so I'm going with cool blues that are complementary to that orange before sort of jumping into another layer. But sometimes you sort of want to play around with the saturation and color of that desert and sort of just see maybe a different color might work. Let's see sort of where that goes, because maybe you sort of push it into the blues and the purples there, and you sort of adjust some of the other elements just to see if it sort of holds together before continuing on. And here I am just adding some shadows to those areas. And these are sufficing, just this sort of like bit of shading on the front there, and it looks right. Now, of course, I needed a background element, and I thought, I always love castles and ruins in the distance, and so I threw a layer on overlay and quickly painted in white, and I sort of did this sort of dark tower thing that the perspective isn't exact. I'm just sort of freehanding this. And it's just basically to balance out and sort of give another sort of area there. And of course, you need a bit of gradient to really sell the mist and the depth there. A bit of smoke effect, I sort of jump into effects here, adding a bit of smoke with a brush there, and sort of using a big fat eraser to sort of tone that down. Now, you sort of need a few sky effects and some other effects like smoke coming off the feet to show that he's been jogging across this desert. I sort of wanted those little puffs of smoke there, and some added smoke to the snake. And this is just sort of brush and eraser work, really. You brush, you erase, you brush, you erase. And the logo sort of has to be tied in as well, and so a nice little bit of a glow outline, and behind that I'm just sort of painting in some smoke there, and again with the eraser sort of just really fudging that to give it that real 70s 80s type of glossy cover, quest fantasy type look, to really tie it in there. The glows are basically just quickly striped on whites with a Gaussian blur, and then just sort of played around with the transfer modes, and then just quickly brushed in with a pencil brush a few extra highlights there, just to really tie it in all together and keep it sort of that illustrative look. Now the desert definitely needs a bit of texture there, so I'm just using some texture brushes. The hero needs to sort of be brought out of the background, and the cheat there is to use a thick pencil texture brush and brush behind in a bit of white to really give him a bit of a halo. You don't really notice it exactly. Now finally, just some adjustment layers, and sort of, again, not quite happy with the desert. I'm really sort of working those colors and everything there to really sort of sell all this. and still not happy with the desert color, and so I decided to go back to that yellowy orange in the end, because I think this works the best. You know, the orange, green, the blue, and then it's just details. It's sort of like, okay, integrate this part of the character here into that, and so on. And, you know, the last few minutes or hours are always spent in adjusting and sort of like really trying to push some elements and bring some elements back and so on, before you sort of get to that, you know, you just have to say, okay, you know what, I'm done here, once you've sort of done those touches. So I've finished the artwork now, and I'm just sort of like sitting back and looking at it for a little bits before. Now, this final version, you can see that I've added a few sparkles, a moon, and I'm quite happy with it overall. I've even sort of included these sort of cactuses in the foreground instead of those rocks. And yeah, now it's off to the client for the purposes of printing.